The Dream by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. Dreams. What age or what country of the world has not felt and acknowledged the mystery of their origin and end? I have thought not a little upon the subject, which has been often forced upon my attention, and sometimes strangely enough, and yet I have never arrived at anything which at all appeared a satisfactory conclusion. It does appear that a mental phenomenon so extraordinary cannot be wholly without its use. We know indeed that in the olden times it has been made the organ of communication between the deity and his creatures, and when a dream produces upon a mind, to all appearance hopelessly reprobate and depraved, an effect so powerful and so lasting as to break down the inveterate habits and to reform the life of an abandoned sinner, we see in the result, in the reformation of morals which appeared incorrigible, in the reclamation of a human soul which seemed to be irretrievably lost, something more than could be produced by a mere chimera of the slumbering fancy, something more than could arise from the capricious images of a terrified imagination. And while reason rejects as absurd the superstition which will read a prophecy in every dream, she may, without violence to herself, recognize, even in the wildest and most incongruous of the wanderings of a slumbering intellect, the evidences and the fragments of a language which may be spoken, which has been spoken, to terrify, to warn, and to command. We have reason to believe, too, by the promptness of action which in the age of the prophets followed all intimations of this kind, and by the strength of conviction and strange permanence of the effects resulting from certain dreams in latter times, which effects we ourselves may have witnessed, that when this medium of communication has been employed by the deity, the evidences of his presence have been unequivocal. My thoughts were directed to this subject in a manner to leave a lasting impression upon my mind, by the events which I shall now relate, the statement of which, however extraordinary, is nevertheless accurate. About the year 17-something, having been appointed to the living of C.H., I rented a small house in the town which bears the same name. One morning in the month of November I was awakened before my usual time by my servant, who bustled into my bedroom for the purpose of announcing a sick call. As the Catholic Church holds her last rites to be totally indispensable to the safety of the departing sinner, no conscientious clergyman can afford a moment's unnecessary delay, and in little more than 5 minutes I stood ready, cloaked and booted for the road, in the small front parlour in which the messenger who was to act as my guide awaited my coming. I found a poor little girl crying piteously near the door, and after some slight difficulty I ascertained that her father was either dead or just dying. "And what may be your father's name, my poor child?" said I. She held down her head as if ashamed. I repeated the question, and the wretched little creature burst into floods of tears still more bitter than she had shed before. At length, almost angered by conduct which appeared to me so unreasonable, I began to lose patience, and I said rather harshly, "If you will not tell me the name of the person to whom you would lead me, your silence can arise from no good motive, and I might be justified in refusing to go with you at all."
"Oh, don't say that, cried she. "Oh, sir, it was that I was afeard of when I would not tell you. I was afeard when you heard his name you would not come with me. But it is no use hiding it now. It's Pat Connell, the carpenter, your honour."
She looked in my face with the most earnest anxiety, as if her very existence depended upon what she should read there. I relieved the child at once. The name, indeed, was most unpleasantly familiar to me, but however fruitless my visits and advice might have been at another time, the present was too fearful an occasion to suffer my doubts of their utility, or my reluctance to reattempting what appeared a hopeless task, to weigh even against the lightest chance that a consciousness of his imminent danger might produce in him a more docile and tractable disposition. Accordingly, I told the child to lead the way and followed her in silence. She hurried rapidly through the long, narrow street which forms the great thoroughfare of the town. The darkness of the hour, rendered still deeper by the close approach of the old-fashioned houses which lowered in tall obscurity on either side of the way, the damp, dreary chill which renders the advance of morning peculiarly cheerless, combined with the object of my walk, to visit the deathbed of a presumptuous sinner, to endeavour, almost against my own conviction, to infuse a hope into the heart of a dying reprobate, a drunkard, but too probably perishing under the consequences of some mad fit of intoxication. All these circumstances served to enhance the gloom and solemnity of my feelings, as I silently followed my little guide, who with quick steps traversed the uneven pavement of the main street. After a walk of about 5 minutes, she turned off into a narrow lane of that obscure and comfortless class which is to be found in almost all small old-fashioned towns. Chill, without ventilation, reeking with all manner of offensive effluviae, and lined by dingy, smoky, sickly and pent-up buildings, frequently not only in a wretched, but in a dangerous condition. "Your father has changed his abode since I last visited him, and I'm afraid much for the worst," said I.
"Indeed he has, sir, but we must not complain," replied she. "We have to thank God that we have lodging and food, though it's poor enough it is, your honour."
Poor child, thought I, how many an older head might learn wisdom from thee! How many a luxurious philosopher who is skilled to preach but not to suffer! Might not thy patient words put to the blush? The manner and language of my companion were alike above her years and station, and indeed in all cases in which the cares and sorrows of life have anticipated their usual date, and have fallen, as they sometimes do, with melancholy prematurity to the lot of childhood, I have observed the result to have proved uniformly the same. A young mind, to which joy and indulgence have been strangers, and to which suffering and self-denial have been familiarized from the first, acquires a solidity and an elevation which no other discipline could have bestowed, and which, in the present case, communicated a striking but mournful peculiarity to the manners, even to the voice, of the child. We paused before a narrow crazy door, which she opened by means of a latch, and we forthwith began to ascend the steep and broken stairs which led to the sick man's room. As we mounted flight after flight towards the garret floor, I heard more and more distinctly the hurried talking of many voices. I could also distinguish the low sobbing of a female. On arriving upon the uppermost lobby, these sounds became fully audible.
"This way, your honour,"
said my little conductress. At the same time, pushing open a door of patched and half-rotten plank, she admitted me into the squalid chamber of death and misery. But one candle, held in the fingers of a scared and haggard-looking child, was burning in the room, and that so dim that all was twilight or darkness except within its immediate influence. The general obscurity, however, served to throw into prominent and startling relief the deathbed and its occupant. The light fell with horrible clearness upon the blue and swollen features of the drunkard. I did not think it possible that a human countenance could look so terrific. The lips were black and drawn apart, the teeth were firmly set, the eyes a little unclosed, and nothing but the whites appearing. Every feature was fixed and livid, and the whole face wore a ghastly and rigid expression of despairing terror such as I never saw equalled. His hands were crossed upon his breast and firmly clenched, while, as if to add to the corpse-like effect of the whole, some white cloths dipped in water were wound about the forehead and temples. As soon as I could remove my eyes from this horrible spectacle, I observed my friend Dr. D, one of the most humane of a humane profession, standing by the bedside. He had been attempting, but unsuccessfully, to bleed the patient, and had now applied his finger to the pulse. "Is there any hope?" I inquired in a whisper. A shake of the head was the reply. There was a pause while he continued to hold the wrist, but he waited in vain for the throb of life. It was not there, and when he let go the hand it fell stiffly back into its former position upon the other. "The man is dead," said the physician, as he turned from the bed where the terrible figure lay. Dead, thought I, scarcely venturing to look upon the tremendous and revolting spectacle. Dead, without an hour for repentance, even a moment for reflection. Dead, without the rights which even the best should have. Was there a hope for him? The glaring eyeball, the grinning mouth, the distorted brow, that unutterable look in which a painter would have sought to embody the fixed despair of the nethermost hell. These were my answer. The poor wife sat at a little distance, crying as if her heart would break. The younger children clustered round the bed, looking with wondering curiosity upon the form of death, never seen before. When the first tumult of uncontrollable sorrow had passed away, availing myself of the solemnity and impressiveness of the scene, I desired the heart-stricken family to accompany me in prayer. And all knelt down while I solemnly and fervently repeated some of those prayers which appeared most applicable to the occasion. I employed myself thus in a manner which I trusted was not unprofitable, at least to the living, for about 10 minutes, and having accomplished my task, I was the first to arise. I looked upon the poor, sobbing, helpless creatures who knelt so humbly around me, and my heart bled for them. With a natural transition, I turned my eyes from them to the bed in which the body lay, and, great God! What was the revulsion, the horror which I experienced on seeing the corpse-like terrific thing seated half upright before me! The white cloths which had been wound about the head had now partly slipped from their position, and were hanging in grotesque festoons about the face and shoulders, while the distorted eyes leered from amid them. A sight to dream of, not to tell. I stood actually riveted to the spot. The figure nodded its head and lifted its arm, I thought, with a menacing gesture. 1,000 confused and horrible thoughts at once rushed upon my mind. I had often read that the body of a presumptuous sinner who, during life, had been the willing creature of every satanic impulse, had been known, after the human tenant had deserted it, to become the horrible sport of demoniac possession. I was roused by the piercing scream of the mother, who now, for the first time, perceived the change which had taken place. She rushed towards the bed, but, stunned by the shock and overcome by the conflict of violent emotions, before she reached it, she fell prostrate upon the floor. I am perfectly convinced that had I not been startled from the torpidity of horror in which I was bound by some powerful and arousing stimulant, I should have gazed upon this unearthly apparition until I had fairly lost my senses. As it was, however, the spell was broken. Superstition gave way to reason. The man whom all believed to have been actually dead was living. Dr. D was instantly standing by the bedside, and upon examination he found that a sudden and copious flow of blood had taken place from the wound which the lancet had left, and this, no doubt, had effected his sudden and almost preternatural restoration to an existence from which all thought he had been for ever removed. The man was still speechless, but he seemed to understand the physician, when he forbade his repeating the painful and fruitless attempts which he made to articulate, and he at once resigned himself quietly into his hands. I left the patient with leeches upon his temples and bleeding freely, apparently with little of the drowsiness which accompanies apoplexy. Indeed, Dr. D told me that he had never before witnessed a seizure which seemed to combine the symptoms of so many kinds, and yet which belonged to none of the recognized classes. It certainly was not apoplexy, catalepsy, nor delirium tremens, and yet it seemed in some degree to partake of the properties of all. It was strange, but stranger things are coming. During 2 or 3 days Dr. D would not allow his patient to converse in a manner which could excite or exhaust him with anyone. He suffered him merely as briefly as possible to express his immediate wants, and it was not until the 4th day after my early visit, the particulars of which I have just detailed, that it was thought expedient that I should see him, and then only because it appeared that his extreme importunity and impatience to meet me were likely to retard his recovery more than the mere exhaustion attendant upon a short conversation could possibly do. Perhaps, too, my friend entertained some hope that if by holy confession his patient's bosom were eased of the perilous stuff which no doubt oppressed it, his recovery would be more assured and rapid. It was then, as I have said, upon the 4th day after my first professional call, that I found myself once more in the dreary chamber of want and sickness. The man was in bed and appeared low and restless. On my entering the room he raised himself in the bed and muttered twice or thrice, "Thank God! Thank God!" I signed to those of his family who stood by to leave the room, and took a chair beside the bed. So soon as we were alone, he said rather doggedly, "There's no use in telling me of the sinfulness of bad ways. I know it all. I know where they lead to. I have seen everything about it with my own eyesight, as plain as I see you." He rolled himself in the bed as if to hide his face in the clothes, and then suddenly raising himself he exclaimed with startling vehemence, "Look, sir, there is no use in mincing the matter. I am blasted with the fires of hell. I have been in hell. What do you think of that? In hell? I am lost forever. I have not a chance. I am damned already. Damned! Damned!" The end of his sentence was actually shouted. His vehemence was perfectly terrific. He threw himself back and laughed and sobbed hysterically. I poured some water into a teacup and gave it to him. After he had swallowed it, I told him if he had anything to communicate, to do so as briefly as he could, and in a manner as little agitating to himself as possible, threatening at the same time, though I had no intention of doing so, to leave him at once in case he again gave way to such passionate excitement. "It's only foolishness," he continued, "for me to try to thank you for coming to such a villain as myself at all. It's no use for me to wish good to you, or to bless you, for such as me has no blessings to give." I told him that I had but done my duty, and urged him to proceed to the matter which weighed upon his mind. He then spoke nearly as follows. "I came in drunk on Friday night last, and got to my bed here. I don't remember how. Sometime in the night it seemed to me I wakened, and feeling uneasy in myself, I got up out of the bed. I wanted the fresh air, but I would not make a noise to open the window, for fear I'd waken the Crathers. It was very dark and troublesome to find the door, but at last I did get it, and I groped my way out, and went down as easy as I could. I felt quite sober, and I counted the steps one after another as I was going down, that I might not stumble at the bottom. When I came to the first landing place, God be about as always, the floor it sunk under me, and I went down, till the senses almost left me. I do not know how long I was falling, but it seemed to me a great while. When I came rightly to myself at last, I was sitting near the top of a great table, and I could not see the end of it, if it had any, it was so far off. And there was men beyond reckoning sitting down all along by it, at each side, as far as I could see at all. I did not know at first was it in the open air, but there was a close smothering feeling in it that was not natural, and there was a kind of light that my eyesight never saw before, red and unsteady, and I did not see for a long time where it was coming from, until I looked straight up, and then I seen that it came from great balls of blood-coloured fire that were rolling high overhead with a sort of rushing, trembling sound, and I perceived that they shone on the ribs of a great roof of rock that was arched overhead instead of the sky. When I seen this, scarce knowing what I did, I got up and I said, I have no right to be here. I must go. And the man that was sitting at my left hand only smiled and said, Sit down again. You can never leave this place. And his voice was weaker than any child's voice I ever heard. And when he was done speaking, he smiled again. Then I spoke out very loud and bold, and I said, In the name of God, let me out of this bad place. And there was a great man that I did not see before, sitting at the end of the table that I was near, and he was taller than 12 men, and his face was very proud and terrible to look at. And he stood up and stretched out his hand before him, and when he stood up, all that was there, great and small, bowed down with a sighing sound, and a dread came on my heart. And he looked at me, and I could not speak. I felt I was his own, to do what he liked with, for I knew at once who he was. And he said, If you promise to return, you may depart for a season. And the voice he spoke with was terrible and mournful, and the echoes of it went rolling and swelling down the endless cave and mixing with the trembling of the fire overhead, so that when he sat down there was a sound after him all through the place, like the roaring of a furnace. And I said, with all the strength I had, I promise to come back. In God's name let me go. And with that I lost the sight and the hearing of all that was there. And when my senses came to me again, I was sitting in the bed with the blood all over me, and you and the rest praying around the room. Here he paused and wiped away the chill drops which hung upon his forehead. I remained silent for some moments. The vision which he had just described struck my imagination not a little, for this was long before Vathek and the Hall of Elbis had delighted the world, and the description which he gave had, as I received it, all the attractions of novelty, beside the impressiveness which always belongs to the narration of an eye-witness, whether in the body or in the spirit, of the scenes which he describes. There was something, too, in the stern horror with which the man related these things, and in the incongruity of his description with the vulgarly received notions of the great place of punishment, and of its presiding spirit, which struck my mind with awe, almost with fear. At length he said with an expression of horrible imploring earnestness which I shall never forget, "Well, sir, is there any hope? Is there any chance at all? Or is my soul pledged and promised away forever? Is it gone out of my power? Must I go back to the place?" In answering him I had no easy task to perform, for however clear might be my internal conviction of the groundlessness of his fears, and however strong my scepticism respecting the reality of what he had described, I nevertheless felt that his impression to the contrary, and his humility and terror resulting from it, might be made available as no mean engines in the work of his conversion from profligacy, and of his restoration to decent habits and to religious feeling. I therefore told him that he was to regard his dream rather in the light of a warning than in that of a prophecy, that our salvation depended not upon the word or deed of a moment, but upon the habits of a life, that, in fine, if he at once discarded his idle companions and evil habits, and firmly adhered to a sober, industrious, and religious course of life, the powers of darkness might claim his soul in vain, for that there were higher and firmer pledges than human tongue could utter, which promised salvation to him who should repent and lead a new life. I left him much comforted, and with a promise to return upon the next day. I did so, and found him much more cheerful, and without any remains of the dogged sullenness which I suppose had arisen from his despair. His promises of amendment were given in that tone of deliberate earnestness which belongs to deep and solemn determination, and it was with no small delight that I observed, after repeated visits, that his good resolutions, so far from failing, did but gather strength by time. And when I saw that man shake off the idle and debauched companions whose society had for years formed alike his amusement and his ruin, and revive his long discarded habits of industry and sobriety, I said within myself, there is something more in all this than the operation of an idle dream. One day, some time after his perfect restoration to health, I was surprised on ascending the stairs for the purpose of visiting this man, to find him busily employed in nailing down some planks upon the landing-place, through which, at the commencement of his mysterious vision, it seemed to him that he had sunk. I perceived at once that he was strengthening the floor with a view to securing himself against such a catastrophe, and could scarcely forbear a smile as I bid, God bless his work. He perceived my thoughts, I suppose, for he immediately said, I can never pass over that floor without trembling. I'd leave this house if I could, but I can't find another lodging in the town so cheap, and I'll not take a better till I've paid off all my debts, please God. But I could not be easy in my mind till I made it safe as I could. You'll hardly believe me, your honour, that while I'm working, maybe a mile away, my heart is in a flutter the whole way back, with the bare thoughts of the 2 little steps I have to walk upon this bit of a floor. So it's no wonder, sir, I'd try to make it sound and firm with any idle timber I have. I applauded his resolution to pay off his debts, and the steadiness with which he pursued his plans of conscientious economy, and passed on. Many months elapsed, and still there appeared no alteration in his resolutions of amendment. He was a good workman, and with his better habits he recovered his former extensive and profitable employment. Everything seemed to promise comfort and respectability. I have little more to add, and that shall be told quickly. I had one evening met Pat Connell as he returned from his work, and as usual, after a mutual and on his side respectful salutation, I spoke a few words of encouragement and approval. I left him industrious, active, healthy. When I next saw him, not 3 days after, he was a corpse. The circumstances which marked the event of his death were somewhat strange, I might say fearful. The unfortunate man had accidentally met an old friend just returned after a long absence, and in a moment of excitement, forgetting everything in the warmth of his joy, he yielded to his urgent invitation to accompany him into a public house, which lay close by the spot where the encounter had taken place. Connell, however, previously to entering the room, had announced his determination to take nothing more than the strictest temperance would warrant. But oh, who can describe the inveterate tenacity with which a drunkard's habits cling to him through life? He may repent, he may reform, he may look with actual abhorrence upon his past profligacy, but amid all this reformation and compunction, who can tell the moment in which the base and ruinous propensity might not recur, triumphing over resolution, remorse, shame, everything, and prostrating its victim once more in all that is destructive and revolting in that fatal vice? The wretched man left the place in a state of utter intoxication. He was brought home nearly insensible, and placed in his bed. The younger part of the family retired to rest much after their usual hour, but the poor wife remained up, sitting by the fire, too much grieved and shocked at the occurrence of what she had so little expected to settle to rest. Fatigue, however, at length overcame her, and she sank gradually into an uneasy slumber. She could not tell how long she had remained in this state, but when she awakened, and immediately on opening her eyes, she perceived by the faint red light of the smouldering turf embers 2 persons, one of whom she recognized as her husband, noiselessly gliding out of the room.
"Pat, darling, where are you going?"
said she. There was no answer. The door closed after them, but in a moment she was startled and terrified by a loud and heavy crash, as if some ponderous body had been hurled down the stair. Much alarmed, she started up, and going to the head of the staircase she called repeatedly upon her husband, but in vain. She returned to the room, and with the assistance of her daughter, whom I had occasion to mention before, she succeeded in finding and lighting a candle, with which she hurried again to the head of the staircase. At the bottom lay what seemed to be a bundle of clothes, heaped together, motionless, lifeless. It was her husband. In going down the stairs, for what purpose can never be known, he had fallen helplessly and violently to the bottom, and coming head foremost, the spine of the neck had been dislocated by the shock, and instant death must have ensued. The body lay upon that landing-place to which his dream had referred. It is scarcely worth endeavouring to clear up a single point in a narrative where all is mystery. Yet I could not help suspecting that the second figure which had been seen in the room by Connell's wife on the night of his death might have been no other than his own shadow. I suggested the solution of the difficulty, but she told me that the unknown person had been considerably in advance of her husband, and on reaching the door, had turned back as if to communicate something to his companion. It was, then, a mystery. Was the dream verified? Whither had the disembodied spirit sped? Who can say? We know not, but I left the house of death that day in a state of horror which I could not describe. It seemed to me that I was scarce awake. I heard and saw everything as if under the spell of a nightmare. The coincidence was terrible.
The end of The Dream by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu.